Hi there, and thanks for joining this video conference. No surprise, I speak about how participatory methods, such as serious games, can help understand the governance of forest management in a context of climate change. So whether you want to watch the full conference or not, I think that it will be clearer if you already have some take-home messages. So participation, it's more than science only, and it has to be handled with care so to avoid disappointing participants. But good news, with some work, participatory workshops have a real added value to study governance, and it helps stepping back on how adaptation to climate change is framed, and hence it promotes participants' creativity in developing new ideas. And both participants and researchers learn a lot. Local knowledge, know-how, skills in developing new ideas. Here again, it's more than just science. So I'll first start by saying a few words on the context. Why should researchers bother participation? And why are forests so important? And then I'll quickly carry on with the first illustration based on the French serious game, Foster Forest. And I'll continue with a second case study related both to Belgium and Quebec in Canada. Time will fly, so I'll keep some minutes to wrap up my thoughts and let you go with, hopefully, a better understanding of why and how you can think of participatory methods in your own research. So let's go with some contextual insights. I'll be quite quick here because I expect you to already know that forests are at the crossroads of climate change adaptation and mitigation. All over the world, forests provide a vast array of ecosystem services, and mitigation is not the least, thanks to the huge capacity of forests to store carbon in the soil and in trees. Just a few words on the picture on the left. I've chosen this as a reminder that any forest is directly influenced by human management, or indirectly by our human activities, such as invasive species or climate change. So I will stick with the word forest, but it's a convenient shortcut for forest social ecological systems. And from a technical point of view, foresters can adapt to climate change in many different ways. For instance, they can replace the most sensitive species to drought by similar species that better resist water shortage. They can also diversify the species in their forest to increase its resilience, so not to put all their eggs in one basket. And another common adaptation is to harvest trees as soon as their diameter has reached an economic threshold that makes the trees profitable, rather than run the risk to wait a little bit longer and to get more money, but with more climate risks to lose it all. So this is a very crude picture of some of the different adaptations that exist. And my point here is to show you that most often foresters adapt by changing their forests rather than the organization of the forest industry. So after these few words on forest adaptation to climate change, you might think that it's a technical issue, so why bother about participation? Well, it's not all about techniques. Climate change is a wicked problem. It's not well formulated. There are big uncertainties, not on if it will happen or not, but on how fast, how severe the consequences. And there is confusing information sometimes. People's decisions are affected by their different values. So participation here is central to help people discuss about their values, exchange their knowledge, and negotiate about the mitigation and adaptation options that they want to implement. And this importance of participation has been outlined more than 30 years ago during the first UN Rio conference, stating that environmental issues are best handled with participation of all concerned citizens at the relevant level. This is also, for instance, the position of the IPCC. Here are 3 short examples at different levels. In EU, citizens have to be involved in the management of water systems and flood prevention. At a more local level, in Quebec, Canada, there is a special commission dedicated to environmental consultation of the citizens, the BAP. And at a more local level, serious games can be used to foster adaptation to climate change, such as here with Stories, which is a game developed for farmers and herders in Western Africa. So participation matters as a democratic right, for sure, but also because it can improve climate policies. For instance, by increasing people's awareness of climate issues, as well as increasing the legitimacy and justice of the policy. And for us researchers, it's an amazing way to learn more about climate change thanks to participants' local knowledge. So I could speak for ages about participation, but if you want to learn more about the topic, I rather recommend you to read Sherry Arnstein's seminal articles or the more recent work of Mark Reed. All you need to know here is that participation, it's any process that directly engages the public in decision-making and gives full consideration to public input in making that decision. So participatory tools range from simple information with a notice of public inquiry to co-decision based on forum theater or world cafes. And here you see other examples such as citizen sciences, just to show you that it's not always involving people in the decision, because here people are just crowdsourcing data, for instance. With all this in mind, we come to governance. For definition lovers, I've put here a quote from Schmitter, but I'll jump to the figure. Here, the governance of forest is a matter of how providers and beneficiaries of ecosystem services interact among and between them, and how they rearrange their mutual, or opposite interests to develop individual or collective adaptations to climate change. Which brings us to these 3 questions on governance. My point in the next 2 examples is to showcase the added value of participatory methods regarding who talks with whom about what formal and informal adaptation to climate change are designed, and what are the peculiarities of participatory methods in governance research. So let's now go on with our first example, the serious game Foster Forest. During my PhD in France, I found that every single forester would at once say, we should not put all our eggs in one basket, meaning that it would be smart to undertake parallel adaptations instead of focusing on species replacement or only species diversification. And yet, adaptation was vastly concentrating on the adaptation of timber production based on technical approaches. So it's not so diverse. And I wanted to explore alternate ways to adapt based on social and economic approaches. So I needed a tool focusing on groups at a regional scale, which could simulate forest management using a computer and a small ecological model, and stimulate adaptations on the social and economic aspects of forestry. Hence, I created the serious game Foster Forest. And in fact, it's a workshop that lasts half a day and which is hosted by a local organization such as a natural park. And this local base, it's important because it helped us in recruiting participants. Because we have 5 participants, someone from the French Forest Service, a mayor from a municipality owning forests, a manager of natural protected area, and 2 woodlot owners. And the workshop first introduces the different roles and their objectives, as well as the list of possible actions. Then the game actually begins for 3 to 5 similar rounds, each corresponding to a 10-year period. And finally, we have time for a collective debriefing, which allows participants to provide feedback. And before I get into the details, please keep in mind that the game is organized around climate change because the way trees grow from one round to the other is heavily impacted by droughts and mortality. And I tell you that, but participants didn't know how severe climate change would be when they played. So this is how it actually looks like. Participants meet around the table from where they can see a projection of the simulated forest on the wall. All participants have to keep their economic budget balanced and try to maintain a relative balance between forest regeneration and game, such as deers. But they also have individual objectives. The area manager must implement a program for the conservation of old-growth forests and also promote anything likely to favor carbon storage. The mayor must avoid the deterioration of water quality and promote forestry operations that positively contribute to the forest landscape. The public forester must harvest a lot of trees to sustain the local timber industry. And finally, the woodlot owners must have enough money to cover the cost of inheritance taxes the day he'll die. So to reach their goal, participants can do any usual action that is practiced in forestry, such as cutting more or less trees or planting different species on their plots. And there are other actions regarding forest management, such as, for instance, buying or selling forest plots. I also had it pre-coded, ready-to-use actions to help me implement players' ideas. So for instance, I had a hidden function to calculate carbon flows in every property if players wanted to develop a system of payment for carbon storage. So once players have decided what to do, their actions are entered into the computer, but they need information to make their decisions. And the information is mostly displayed with maps on the wall screen. Who owns what? What is the soil quality, for instance? And of course, participants can see what trees stand on their plots, specified by species and size. So as a step represents 10 years, each new step starts with decadal projections for climate change, as well as timber and carbon prices. But most important, the success indicators used by the players are automatically updated by the computer and displayed on a temporary window. And this is a crucial moment for players because they can discuss about the impacts of climate change on their forest, and also, if they want, decide to launch a collective adaptation to climate change. So I will now come back on the results of workshops that were organized in France in 2019. So regarding who talks with whom about what, first, forest and conservation experts spoke more than lay participants, and they spoke more to each other than to non-specialists. But it's fine because it was also a chance for knowledge sharing between the participants. Second, the discussions on the impacts of climate change and what to do were concentrating on the more profitable ecosystem services, namely timber production and hunting, and then on conservation and mitigation issues. The second perspective on governance is, what do participants do to adapt? Well, from the economic point of view, foresters quickly noticed that their money derives from timber production, which is threatened by climate change. In response, they developed a system of payment for carbon storage. And for instance, we had a private forest advisor explaining, I relied on carbon contracts to diversify my income and try not to be too dependent on timber prices. End of quote. So during the debriefings, some protected area managers stressed that even if it's unsuccessful, a contract negotiation provides an opportunity because it raises owners' awareness about mitigation and conservation issues. And the third perspective on governance relates to the added value of participation. We witnessed a lot of technical learnings between participants, sometimes complex, such as when a public forester and a mayor went into the very details of who should take care of forest roads and how. But social learnings also occurred, for instance, when a woodlot owner spoke with the mayor about how difficult it is to satisfy inhabitants' requests regarding how municipal forests are managed. But in my opinion, the best was when participants stepped back to reconsider the purely technical approach of adaptation and think in terms of shown words: information, education, contractualization, diversification, and so on. So this is it for the serious game Foster Forest, and I now speak about another participatory approach based on ARDI workshops. It's part of a bigger project comparing the resilience of different adaptation strategies in the temperate forest of Quebec and Wallonia in Belgium. And the big idea is to combine climate change and adaptation scenarios, so to provide projections of forest resilience at different temporal and spatial scales. So I wanted to complement the adaptation recommendations coming from the projections with ideas from people working in the field. So in other words, to ask foresters how we can help woodlot owners adapt to climate change. So I've designed ARDI workshops. This method aims to produce an interaction diagram, which is a network made of actors, resources, and that evolves depending on different dynamics. So it's participatory because it's not me, but foresters who list the actors, resources, and dynamics important to our issue and who create the interaction diagram. And I really appreciate ARDI because it's easy to relate everything to the conceptual framework that I use to study governance. And because as well, it's very simple as writing on Post-its. So in my case, I've decided to organize 5 separate workshops, one with woodlot owners, of course, but also with 4 other kinds of forest stakeholders. And in the end, I collect different data at the individual and group levels that help me understand the different visions that participants have of adaptation to climate change. And in fact, participants speak about themselves and about the others, and this tells you a lot about how they frame the issue at stake. But we also know and understand what they think of the other groups, and this makes it possible to compare what each group thinks of forest adaptation to climate change with what other participants think they think. So here are some preliminary results from the Belgian workshops. ARDI workshops are more balanced than serious games in the distribution of speaking time, among other because workshops separate the stakeholders in homogeneous groups. And this highly reduces the fear of non-experts of being taken for a newbie, for instance. A second difference is the more comprehensive approach that ARDI workshops provide, and this encourages foresters to speak of a broader number of ecosystem services. In fact, each post-it is discussed by the group, so it's easier as well to identify the providers and beneficiaries of forest ecosystem services. And surprisingly, the participants did not quite focus on financial levers, but rather had a strong demand for training, individual support, and awareness raising of climate change. And they also really wanted a strong leadership from their governments, which outlines the main role that governments have in structuring the governance of adaptation to climate change. And finally, we found that participatory workshops are really relevant to study because it helps understand mental models and comparing different groups. And participants also appreciate the networking side effect of the workshop, especially after 2 years of COVID pandemics. So it's time to conclude with a few take-home messages. First, participation can bring many good things, but it has to be handled with care because it's not neutral. You have to account for the relative power, financial or political power of participants, and be careful of including also the most vulnerable stakeholders. Rules about the how and the why of the research have to be clear enough. So for instance, I had participants sign a clear engagement contract at the beginning of a workshop. And this often requires working in partnership with the local institutions whose work is to build trust between stakeholders, especially for people like me, like postdocs, with short or mid-term contracts, because we don't have the time to build this trust. Governance now. Participatory workshops really help in stepping back to think about how the adaptation issue is framed. And this is sometimes a way toward a consensual collective adaptation. The outcomes of different workshops can be quite different, from a demand for more government to decentralized actions based on voluntary contracts. And participants and researchers are most often very happy because everybody learns at different levels. And this can be local knowledge, but also social skills, such as how to use climate projections to argue on adaptation options. And third, just a reminder that my talk was a very narrow insight of the wonders that participatory workshops can help accomplish. But of course, there are way more methods and projects all over the world. So it's now yours to discover. And once again, thanks for your attention, and please feel free to contact me now or later. Goodbye.